Far to the west of the Twin Peninsulas, within the southern Ortegal Mountains, was another Twilight-era culture known broadly as the Copper Kingdoms. Though still a term used today, even if much less so, the Copper Kingdoms was the name of the broad and various groups of southern Uthapaba, who are known, as the name implies, for being the only reliable supply of copper and other raw metals during the Twilight Era and the early portions of the Dawn Era. The term Copper Kingdoms wasn't what they referred to themselves as at all. Rather, it was an overarching name given to them by the Amur or Urhij, the dominant power throughout most of the Dawn Era. In reality, the Copper Kingdoms could be split into many different cultural groups, and within those, multiple tribal monarchies and city-states with their own motives, rulers, alliances, and microcultures, who are all often allied with or vassalized by one another. Of these Copper Kingdoms, the two most major cities in their respective cultures were Ahir with Oikumiakishao and Gyupi with Introspection. Nestled northwest in the Copper Kingdoms among the cold, stony peaks of the Ortegal Mountains, Ahir was known for many things. The hardworking tenacity of its people, their often loud, bombastic, and confident personalities, its thriving mining, smithing, and forging industries, its sprawling subterranean district, its reputation as a city of the arts, and its intricate and fantastical stories and legends relayed through prose and poetry and song. On the Ahir's surface, its more colorful elements were lesser known, but from a distance, the city appeared to be a small, snow-covered stone city whose size was betrayed by its underground segments and whose color palette consisted of gray and white with harsh metallic accents. As you neared the city, you heard the chimes, bells, gongs, and harmonic singing blasting through the streets, whose walls were adorned with colorful paintings and carvings representing past people and events from old legends. Even the architecture becomes more impressive as you study it, for its austere precision and complex engravings are emblematic of masterful masons and stoneworkers. The people all adorned their hair and facial hair with bells and chimes and wore jewelry of a similar nature. They played instruments and sang on balconies and porches. Groups of performers marched through the streets, singing hymns and epics for donations. Their tools and weapons were made with small holes in them, so that they whistled when used. Ahir art didn't stop with music. They also loved to engage in theatrical plays. These plays were often quite brutal and to most others far too realistic. For if a character in the play was meant to be harmed or even killed, the actor would have that inflicted on them, making acting a death sentence much of the time. Prisoners and slaves were often forced into acting out these events as a form of punishment and execution. The alternative would be forced labor until death, which was often viewed as a less desirable outcome. Many of these plays and much of the music created by Ahir would be performed abroad for other cultures, primarily the Parama Mereki, where they would create amphitheaters to stage their arts for the people. Most of the musical instruments and theatrics of southwestern cultures in Uthapaba can all be tied back in some manner to Ahir. The king of Ahir, for as long as is known, always wore the same crown generation after generation. That to call it a crown is a disservice. The apparatus upon the mountain monarch's head was a brass contraption of bells and whistles that, though generously padded inside, crushed the head of the king. It rested not just upon the head, but down onto the shoulders and uppermost back as a metal behemoth. From out of the top, slotted cylinders like flutes of varying lengths and width jutted into the air that played in the cool wind. It's said that the winds were Uther spirits that sang to the king words of ancestral wisdom as a lullaby of the lamented. It is also said that the wisest men in Ahir could even judge the time, day, and seasons based on the sound of the city alone, and many of the major decisions, including the placement of every coveted mine, were left up to the whims of dowsing rods that professed the will of the ground with pulsing vibrations. The city itself was even said to be deafening at the best of times, with parades and celebrations being loud enough to level the tops of mountains and be heard as far as the Amur or Umaun. This is one explanation for the many underground sections of the city, that the sounds from the surface would be deafened and dissipated by the time they reached the lower dwellings. Much of these cultural tendencies can be explained by the beliefs of Oikumiakishao, the main cultural/religious system of Ahir. They believe that their god Earthalth sings and drums the world of Achotha into existence, and that his godly songs and tales are the stories of the past, present, and future. They believe that sound is the most fundamental and powerful force and building block of Achotha, and more metaphysically, so are stories themselves. Without stories, histories, and legends, there is nothing. It is stories that cement the world into existence, keeping it real, tangible, and growing, and that with each new verse of Earthalth's song, new legends and events are sung into reality to keep Achotha grounded and stable. The people of Oikoumia Gishaw emulate Earthalth's creation by making their own tales and stories, viewing it as Earthalth creating through them as a proxy, as if they are a background instrument, adding their own depth and flavor to the bass drumming and lyrics of the world's song. In theory, this should mean that the people of Ahir should have a bountiful record of past histories and events of the Twilight Era, and this is true, but with a major caveat. Ahir culture believes that the most important elements of any kind of story is not its truth and accuracy, but its moral and lesson. They expect and even encourage embellishments, omissions, additions, symbolisms, metaphors, and allegories all throughout their records, written or oral, so long as these clever lies, half-truths, and double meanings further the intended takeaway of the story. It doesn't help that there are many stories happening simultaneously, or made only within the context of another story, only for them to contradict and lead to paradoxes. This makes understanding the history of Ahir convoluted and sometimes outrightly impossible, requiring years of scholarly research and an intimate knowledge of local customs to begin to understand. The other major city-state, Gyupi, had a much different culture. Located southeast of Ahir, less in the mountains themselves and more in the neighboring highlands, Gyupi's extensive mining efforts and its mostly unmapped and uncovered cave networks made it a formidable opponent in the race for raw metals. Gyupi's long loyal vassal of Azuthimi also gave them an agrarian and fishing edge, and Gyupi's broader focus on animal husbandry and shepherds gave them a surplus in a region otherwise difficult to get reliable food. The people of Gyupi were also renowned for their masterful stoneworkers and masons, whose statues, architectures, and even stone shipyards were unique and awe-inspiring. Gyupi was also masterful in their use of ceramics. They had concoctions of materials that, when properly fired, were stronger than any known metal and white as bone. Their ceramics were used for practically everything. Various tools, day-to-day household items, decorations, building materials, weapons and armor, and more. Gyupi soldiers were visually distinct due to their heavy use of ceramic. Their armor was shaped in a way to look as if it were made of bone, their helmets like skulls, and the space between the ceramic plates were held together by many red-dyed ropes that allowed for flexibility and protection and looked like muscles and sinew. Gyupi ceramic was far more expensive than the copper they were known for, but nonetheless it was still a major export in Gyupi society. Gyupi also took inspiration from Ahir, adopting their love for music. Many of the cultural motifs and symbolism of Gyupi were sound-based, and though those of introspection rarely wore the bells and chimes of Ahir, they still stomped their feet, drummed their bellies, clapped their hands, and sang oral traditions and what they called skin songs, and since the only instrument needed was the self, anybody could participate. The people of Gyupi were most known, not for their mining, agriculture, architecture, masonry, or whatever else, but for introspection, a cultural/religious practice seen by most foreigners outside the Copper Kingdoms as profane, evil, and inspired by the more demonic Uther spirits. Introspection, in short, is the belief that Achotha itself is a god of death, flesh, mortality, challenge, and sacrifice, and that the Angau are all his children, for they were created in his death. This belief, though peculiar, is not what invokes the ire of neighboring peoples, but rather it's their peculiar form of worship. They believe that in order to understand not just themselves, but Achotha too, they must engage in literal, physical introspection, in which they carve into their flesh with knives or other sharp implements, permanently scarring upon their skin words, symbols, proverbs, and names. They do this as a permanent reminder of lessons learned in life. They believe that pain, suffering and punishment are the best forms of learning and growing, and that by inflicting themselves with scars and pain, they also inflict scars upon their minds, molding and shaping their inner and outer beings into something greater. This practice was bloody and permanently disfigured adherents of introspection, especially during the Twilight Era, when it seems that more ancient introspection focused on inflicting as much pain and suffering upon themselves as physically possible. Ancient introspection even seems to have had some cannibalistic tendencies, and they'd even ecstatically rub dirt and filth into their scarred wounds to further their misery. Likely on account of their faith, Gyupi and the wider introspection-worshipping Copper Kingdoms had a relatively advanced amount of knowledge on biology and medicine, paradoxically making introspection a faith that increased their lifespans overall, at least for those who survived their scarification rituals. Worthy of note is also the matter of slavery. The Copper Kingdoms were the most prolific slavers on all of Uthapaba perhaps ever. They purchased many slaves, primarily from the tribes of Ortegal and Antithesis, a mark against the culture all the way up to the Dusk Era. While it's true that most people included slavery in their culture in some way or form, be them as prisoners, war spoils, or debt bonded, the extent of slavery in the Copper Kingdoms was abysmal. Slavery was prevalent in every of the kingdoms, especially the wealthiest and most influential of them. Best case scenario, the slaves worked back-breaking labor, breathing in the underground dust until they went blind and their lungs turned black before being crushed by rubble and mine collapses, and in the worst case scenario, they were experimented on in deep dungeons in Gyupi, where slaves were dissected alive and studied to further understand anatomy and affliction. The true extent of these torturous experiments is unknown, for the records were stricken or hidden by later, more civilized descendants. But what is known is that the fates of these unlucky slaves were worse than any other on Achotha. Their deaths weren't in vain, however, for this is likely one of the reasons for the second-to-none medical and anatomical knowledge of Gyupi, and practically the entirety of Angel biology was founded by Gyupi, including many fields of embibetics. Despite modern sensibilities viewing Gyupi's slavery as barbaric and horrid, the people of Gyupi viewed it as benevolent. They had the view that, if somebody is unwilling to be productive willingly, they should be made productive unwillingly and have their lives be put to a pragmatic and beneficial use. This warped thinking was likely encouraged further by Gyupi's reverence for labor and hard work in general, especially as a more mild form of their introspection practices. In terms of the Copper Kingdom's historical significance during the Twilight Era, it can be difficult to discern, but based on Ahi-era oral traditions, writings inscribed onto statues and walls in Gyupi, and the works of the philosopher and historian Uaun-Agurn, a few events can be vaguely gleamed. Trade records point towards frequent trade with Horjan and the Prama-Mereki. There's evidence of wars between the Copper Kingdoms, including a major conflict in which Urthalthink, once the dominant power of the Copper Kingdoms, was defeated by Ahi-era, who then replaced Urthalthink as a dominant power in the region. And there are records of conflicts with the tribes of Antithesis, the tribes of Ortegal, the tribes of the Toyat River, and even potentially a major conflict on the Otoapaika between the Copper Kingdoms, the Prama-Mereki, a now lost city named Ajumapur, and the Templars of the Heart against Ugernk that ended in a bloody but decisive victory for the Copper Kingdoms. Unfortunately, not much more than these broad strokes can be said, and even some of these points, such as the aforementioned war against Ugernk, aren't even entirely concrete due to Ahi-era's proclivity to embellish and undoubtedly make themselves appear more just. It wouldn't be until much later into the Dawn Era, with the works of Uaun-Agurn and the eventful rise of King Achikani, that the records and centralization of the Copper Kingdoms would occur.